No, I am not a friend. I am not afraid. Sorry. I am not a friend of this. Doesn't matter.
What would you do if your husband had female bodyguards instead of male guards? In the case of Safia, the wife of Gaddafi, only she can tell her story of what she endured while married to a powerful man who was known to be a dictator in Libya for over 40 years. In this video, we will examine how Safia, a reserved and easygoing woman, got entangled with a cold-hearted man like Gaddafi. Early life and marriage of Safia Farkash.
How do you get out of this situation right now?
We need time, a few days, and everything will change.
Safia Farkash was born in 1952 in Al-Baida, Libya, into a well-to-do family. Not so much is known about her early life, but she pursued a career as a nurse, which later became a significant part of her life story. Many have often wondered why the wife of a man like Gaddafi does not have a life history that is well known to the public. After all, even less significant entities have their history documented. The reason is mostly because Gaddafi was larger than life, while his wife was in the shadows. Anyway, Safia met Muammar Gaddafi in 1968 while working at a Benghazi hospital. According to The Guardian, Gaddafi was admitted to the hospital after a minor injury where Safia nursed him. During this period, a friendship developed as they found each other easy to talk to. At the time, though, neither knew that Gaddafi would become one of the most powerful leaders in the world. After courting for a while, they agreed to take their relationship to the next level. The couple married in 1970, a few months after Gaddafi's rise to power in 1969. At the time, Gaddafi was building his position as the de facto leader of Libya, and their union was seen as a strategic alliance. Safia, known for her composure and quiet demeanor, was the complete opposite of her husband, Gaddafi, who was popular for his flamboyant and often unpredictable persona. As First Lady, Safia Farkash maintained a low-profile public image. Unlike Gaddafi, who loved the spotlight and would do almost anything to stay in it, Safia rarely gave interviews or made public appearances. Instead, she focused on philanthropic efforts by leading causes like education and healthcare. Her initiatives included funding schools, improving hospital infrastructure, and advocating for better access to healthcare for women and children. In official photographs, Safia often appeared as a dignified and reserved figure who projected an image of stability within the Gaddafi household. According to BBC News, this carefully curated persona was intended to counterbalance Gaddafi's erratic behavior and controversial policies. However, her role as First Lady was not without challenges. Critics argue that her public persona was carefully managed to shield her from the controversies surrounding her husband's regime. For instance, while Safia was promoting social welfare programs, allegations of human rights abuses and corruption under Gaddafi's leadership went to an all-time high. Despite her reserved nature, people always had questions. They were curious about how much Safia knew about Gaddafi's darker side. In case you didn't know, Gaddafi's regime was notorious for its brutal suppression, corruption, and alleged personal misconduct. Some reports, such as those in the Washington Post, suggest that Safia was aware of these abuses but remained silent. According to the popular saying, silence often means agreement. In the case of Safia, her silence has been interpreted in different ways. Some believe that she was complicit in enabling Gaddafi's behavior, while others believe she was a victim of the same oppressive environment that defined his rule. In truth, the cultural norms and the patriarchal structure of Libyan society no doubt played a role in her decision to remain loyal to her husband. Safia's life behind closed doors will always be a mystery because she rarely shared personal details with the media. However, defectors and former insiders have hinted at tensions within the Gaddafi family. According to a 2012 Al Jazeera documentary, some of Gaddafi's children had strained relationships with their father due to his erratic behavior and oppressive policies, which consequently impacted Safia's private life. Gaddafi's female bodyguards. During the reign of Gaddafi, one of the most intriguing and controversial aspects of Muammar Gaddafi's rule was his all-female bodyguard unit. Interestingly, they are known as the Revolutionary Nuns. The unit was introduced in the late 1970s to the delight of everyone who wanted equal opportunities for all genders. To most people, the unit symbolized women's empowerment under Gaddafi's regime. The bodyguards often wore military-style uniforms paired with makeup and manicured nails. This was new. Before anyone could blink an eye, they had become a global spectacle. The women were recruited from universities and military academies and were made to undergo rigorous training in self-defense, firearms, and martial arts. Gaddafi portrayed these women as trailblazers as they challenged traditional gender roles in a deeply patriarchal society. According to BBC News, he often promoted their presence during international trips as he used them as a tool to promote his image as a progressive leader. In his speeches, Gaddafi claimed that the bodyguards were an example of how the revolution had liberated women. However, critics argue that the revolutionary nuns were more of a propaganda tool than a genuine initiative for women's empowerment. The spectacle of the female bodyguards garnered huge media attention, with outlets like The Guardian describing them as part of Gaddafi's eccentric and theatrical persona. You might be wondering what the people and critics meant. Perhaps they were privy to what others didn't know. In truth, there was more to the revolutionary nuns than meets the eye. Beneath the facade of empowerment lay a darker reality. Many allegations have emerged over the years that these women were victims of abuse and coercion. According to testimonies from survivors and human rights organizations, many of the bodyguards were forced into their roles and subjected to physical and intimacy maltreatment by Gaddafi and his inner circle. One of the most damning accounts came after Gaddafi died in 2011, when former bodyguards began to speak out. A 2011 report by The Telegraph quoted several women who described being violated by Gaddafi and his officials. Some were reportedly taken from their homes as teenagers and forced into serving in the unit under the guise of national duty. The abuses were not limited to bodily violence. Many bodyguards faced physical and emotional trauma, living under constant surveillance and threats. Human rights groups like Amnesty International documented accounts of women who described their experiences as dehumanizing and similar to slavery. The plight of Gaddafi's female bodyguards attracted widespread media attention, particularly after his regime collapsed. News stations like The Guardian and BBC News reported extensively on the revelations as they pointed out the stark contrast between the public image of the bodyguards and the reality of their lives. One of the most shocking reports came from a survivor called Soraya, whose story was detailed in The Telegraph. She recounted being violated repeatedly by Gaddafi and his men, a fate she said many of the bodyguards shared. The report described how the women were treated as possessions, stripped of their autonomy, and forced into silence. The international media also criticized the broader implications of Gaddafi's use of bodyguards. While some initially viewed them as a symbol of progress, it became clear that they were another means for Gaddafi to exert control and manipulate public perception. Safia's silence and tolerance. Many people couldn't help but ask heavy questions when the unveiling was made. One of the questions was, what was Safia doing while all of these atrocities were committed? To understand Safia Farkash's silence and tolerance of the horrors her husband inflicted, it's essential to consider the cultural and political context of her life as Gaddafi's wife. Libyan society during Gaddafi's rule was a man's world where women had no significant rights and were not expected to challenge the norm. There were also rigid expectations for women, particularly in traditional roles. Women are to be seen less and not heard at all. As the First Lady, Safia was not only seen as Gaddafi's wife, but also as an extension of his regime. Her role required unwavering loyalty and public support for her husband, regardless of his actions. Under Gaddafi's rule, women's rights were paradoxical. While Gaddafi publicly championed women's empowerment, granting them access to education and employment opportunities, the reality was that power dynamics remained skewed and largely unbalanced. Women in Libya often faced societal and familial pressure to conform to traditional roles, and challenging these norms was rare, especially for someone in Safia's position. According to Al Jazeera, Gaddafi's regime tightly controlled public perception and left little room for dissent, even within his inner circle. For Safia, loyalty to her husband was not just a personal expectation, but a political necessity. As the mother of his children and the matriarch of Libya, any perceived disloyalty could have severe consequences for her and her family. Can you now see the pressure she was under and why she couldn't speak up like many would have wanted? Her tied hands fueled widespread speculation about whether Safia Farkash was aware of Gaddafi's abuses, especially those involving his female bodyguards. Reports from people who used to work for Gaddafi and survivors suggest that she likely knew about the horrors but chose not to intervene. In a 2012 report by The Guardian, a former insider claimed that Safia was fully aware of Gaddafi's misconduct, but turned a blind eye out of fear or a sense of resignation. This aligns with accounts from other members of Gaddafi's inner circle, who described a culture of secrecy and denial within the regime. Nonetheless, some reports suggest that Safia's awareness of her husband's actions may have been limited to whispers and rumors. Gaddafi was known for his paranoia and secrecy, as he often kept his darkest deeds hidden even from those closest to him. However, given her proximity to him and her role in the regime, it is unlikely she was entirely unaware. A New York Times article from 2011 even published the testimonies of former bodyguards who alleged that Gaddafi's family, including Safia, benefited from the wealth and power generated by his regime. In all these, Safia's silence can be examined through various psychological and social lenses. One possible explanation is fear. Gaddafi was not just a husband, but a dictator with immense power. Challenging his authority, even privately, could have put her life and her children's lives at risk. Power percentage within the marriage also played a role. Gaddafi's authoritarian nature extended into his relationships and left Safia with little room to express dissent. As a woman in a patriarchal society, her ability to challenge her husband's actions was further constrained by cultural norms that prioritized loyalty and submission. Denial was also a coping mechanism for Safia. Since she faced the moral conflict of her husband's actions, she may have chosen to suppress or rationalize her knowledge of the abuses. According to Psychology Today, denial is a common response to traumatic or morally distressing situations, particularly when the individual feels powerless to affect change. Another factor could be her desire to protect her family's continuity. As the matriarch of the Gaddafi family, Safia prioritized and maintaining the regime's public image over addressing the moral implications of her husband's actions. This would align with her carefully curated public persona as a dignified and supportive spouse. This was aptly described by The Telegraph as a calculated effort to shield herself from controversy. The fall of Gaddafi, Safia's escape and exile. Like everything with a beginning, Gaddafi's reign ended in 2011 with a dramatic exit. The fall of Muammar Gaddafi was one of the most talked about in the Arab Spring, a series of pro-democracy uprisings that swept across the Middle East and North Africa in 2011. Gaddafi's 42-year rule wasn't one of the easiest. His reign that suppressed human rights and promoted brutal repression with corruption was brought to a violent end as Libyan citizens rose against his regime. How did it all start? What pushed Libyans to say, "No, enough is enough"? The uprising in Libya began in February 2011. Revolutions inspired it in Tunisia and Egypt. Protesters had only two demands. They wanted political reform and an end to Gaddafi's dictatorship. As the rebellion gained momentum, reports of the regime's atrocities began to surface, and they included horrifying accounts of the abuse suffered by Gaddafi's female bodyguards. Survivors recounted stories of violence, manipulation, and abduction, further fueling anger against the regime. The international community also played a big role in Gaddafi's downfall. A NATO-led coalition intervened in Libya, where they enforced a no-fly zone and conducted airstrikes against Gaddafi's forces. By August 2011, rebel forces had taken control of Tripoli, and Gaddafi went into hiding. On the 20th of October, 2011, he was captured by rebel fighters in Sirte. As Gaddafi's regime crumbled, Safia Farkash ran away from Libya with several of her children. Many reports suggested she initially sought refuge in Algeria, where the Algerian government confirmed the entry of Gaddafi's wife and 3 of his children in August of the same year. Despite the allegations against her husband and the atrocities committed under his rule, Safia remained largely silent. She issued no public apologies or acknowledgements of the regime's abuses, including those suffered by Gaddafi's female bodyguards. Some have interpreted this silence as a refusal to take accountability, while others argue that it was her efforts to protect her family and avoid further scrutiny. According to The Telegraph, Safia later expressed her belief that Gaddafi was a martyr and maintained that Western powers had unfairly targeted him. Media and public perception. In the West, following the downfall of Gaddafi in 2011, the portrayal of Safia has been largely critical. Investigative reports, such as those by The Guardian and BBC, often focused on her complicity in the regime's abuses, as they focused on her silence in the face of allegations of human rights violations. These reports questioned her role in the Gaddafi regime, noting that while she may not have directly participated in the atrocities, her failure to speak out seemed to condone the violence tacitly. On the other hand, Middle Eastern outlets were more cautious in their portrayal of Safia. Media coverage in Libya and surrounding countries, where Gaddafi had significant influence, presented her as a more sympathetic figure. Al Jazeera, for example, reported on Safia's exile with a sense of empathy, focusing on the challenges she faced after Gaddafi's fall. They hammered on her loss and portrayed her as a victim of circumstance, rather than an active enabler of the regime's crimes. Documentaries such as Gaddafi's Women were released in 2012, further exploring the complex relationship between Safia and the female bodyguards. While these documentaries talked about the alleged abuse within the bodyguard unit, they also shed light on Safia's role as a mother and wife. To some people, this was a cheap attempt to humanize her in the eyes of a global audience. The perception of Safia Farkash in Libya is more subtle, as it is shaped by the deep political divides that characterize the country's post-Gaddafi era. During Gaddafi's rule, Safia was viewed by many as a loyal and dignified first lady, performing ceremonial duties while simultaneously maintaining a position of privilege. However, after the fall of her husband, public opinion shifted abruptly. For many Libyans, the memories of Gaddafi's rule remain deeply intertwined with their views of Safia. As one Libyan journalist stated in an interview with Libya Herald, "For years, she was the face of the regime. Even though she may not have been the one pulling the strings, her support of Gaddafi made her part of the machine that oppressed us." The notion of her complicity, even if passive, resonated strongly among survivors of Gaddafi's brutality. Among those who were directly affected by Gaddafi's regime, such as former political prisoners and activists, the perception of Safia is less forgiving. Many survivors of Gaddafi's security forces, including former bodyguards, have openly expressed their disdain for her role. One defector, who had worked in Gaddafi's inner circle, told the New York Times, "She knew what was happening to the women who were forced into his service. She didn't stop it. She didn't even speak out." This sentiment ran through much of the Libyan diaspora, where there remains a widespread belief that Safia's silence enabled the regime's worst atrocities. However, among Gaddafi loyalists and those who still admire the former leader's regime, Safia continues to be seen as a victim. For these individuals, she was a woman trapped in a power struggle she could not escape. Survivor testimonies have surfaced that suggest Safia may have been unaware of the full extent of the abuses, or perhaps, at the very least, powerless to stop them. The fact that she fled the country after Gaddafi's death and remained largely silent in the years that followed has done little to alter this perception among her supporters. At the societal level, the Libyan judgment of Safia remains divided. While some see her as a symbol of female strength and endurance within a patriarchal regime, Others view her as an enabler who turned a blind eye to the suffering of countless women. Public opinion continues to evolve as more testimonies come to light, with many questioning whether her actions, or lack thereof, were driven by fear, loyalty, or personal ambition. The illusion torn. Throughout Gaddafi's reign, people often admired the women who always protected him. Many young women even dream of getting the opportunity to serve the liberal leader someday. However, the truth came to light as time passed. Some things were not as they seemed. The infamous Libyan leader, who often portrayed himself as a progressive ruler by elevating women's rights and gender equality, was a wolf in sheep's clothing. Allowing women to serve as bodyguards, which at first glance seemed to be a bold step for female empowerment, was nothing but an illusion. He wasn't at all a feminist. He was a misogynist who did not care about women's rights. If anything, he did well at manipulating public perception. For one, the women who served in Gaddafi's guard were rarely given real authority or responsibility. They were primarily used for show to fulfill the dictator's narrative of a modern, forward-thinking Libya. Many of these women were reportedly chosen not for their skills or training, but for their loyalty to Gaddafi. According to investigative reports from The Guardian, these women were often carefully selected based on their physical appearance and ability to demonstrate solid devotion to the dictator. They were given rifles and uniforms, but in truth, the male guards were tasked with protecting him. The women served a faux function, as they were always on the camera's front lines, but were never involved in real security operations. Despite this, Gaddafi used the presence of these women to present himself as a progressive leader who gave women equal rights. However, in reality, his treatment of women was far from progressive. According to the New York Times and BBC, Gaddafi's regime was built on the oppression of women in other areas of life, with severe restrictions on their freedoms, rights, and opportunities. Women in Libya under Gaddafi had very limited rights outside of the state-controlled narrative, and the leader's promises of gender equality were often hollow. In truth, Gaddafi's reliance on them is a broader strategy of using illusion to maintain control. He sought to give the appearance of forward-thinking policies while suppressing any meaningful progress for women. Behind the scenes, Gaddafi's real security was always in the hands of his male guards, hidden in the corners, while the women stood proudly in front of cameras. One of the key locations that revealed the true nature of their lives was the 77th Brigade building in the central city of Tripoli. With its ruined hangars, this compound distinguished it from nearby and more intact buildings. In this house, the female guards, who were known for their distinctive pink petticoats, were kept. Inside was a devastated scene, with discarded personal items scattered across the rooms. Designer boots, crushed high heels, and wedding photos left behind by the guards painted a portrait of lives upended. The brutality these women faced under Gaddafi's regime was shocking. Many were press-ganged into service and forced to endure systemic abuse. Nisreen Gariani, one of the former guards, shared her harrowing story of being assaulted in a room she described as the blue carpet room. It was a place that became synonymous with violence and terror. She recounts being taken by the hand, aware of what would happen next. Gariani also shared detailed information about her involvement in executing 3 rebels under orders from Gaddafi's forces. She said, "What could I do? If I didn't do that, I wouldn't be here now." For some of these women, loyalty to Gaddafi remained strong, even after the regime's fall. Jamila Khalifa al-Aroun, a 52-year-old woman who had served as a leader in the 77th Brigade, spoke of her honor in serving the dictator. She expressed pride in her role in distributing weapons and supporting Gaddafi's army. "He was a good and noble man, and I was proud to have served," she said. However, she pointed out the superficial standards for selection into Gaddafi's bodyguard unit, such as beauty, height, and long hair. Then she added, "I was never chosen." Despite the role these women played in Gaddafi's inner circle, their lives were not exactly as easy as it was by coercion, fear, and abuse. While some were tasked with ceremonial duties or guarding important areas, others became Gaddafi's eyes and ears. Nisreen Abdul Hadi said, "We were told to report to the family anything strange we saw or heard." Safia Farkash today. After Muammar Gaddafi died in 2011, Safia further recoiled into the shadows. Media reports indicated that she kept a low profile to deal with the loss of both her husband and the luxurious life she had known. The end of her husband's reign meant adapting to a life far removed from the political influence and wealth she had enjoyed. There have been reports, particularly from outlets like The Independent and Al Jazeera, about Safia's attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy for her children. Some outlets mention that she tried to ensure they would live a relatively quiet life, free from the intense political pressures and dangers surrounding the Gaddafi family during the revolution. One of her children, her daughter Aisha Gaddafi, was reportedly involved in legal proceedings, facing accusations in both Libya and abroad. Still, Safia refrained from making loud public statements or engaging in the media spotlight. In the aftermath of Gaddafi's fall, the international community and Libyan authorities questioned the legitimacy of the Gaddafi family's wealth and assets, and Safia was subject to ongoing investigations. She faced the complex reality of losing not only her husband's empire, but also the strong political network and security that had been in place during Gaddafi's reign. Despite the controversies surrounding her and the difficult political climate, Safia continued to try to stay out of the spotlight. As of recent years, there has been little public news about her whereabouts. In 2023, reporters discovered she was residing in Cairo, Egypt. What do you think about Gaddafi and his female bodyguards? Do you believe he was a revolutionary leader, just misunderstood by his people? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoy this video, like, share, and subscribe to this channel.